Hey guys, Mythos here. Today we're going to be taking a look at serialization in C++. Today we're going to be taking a look at a method that uses macros, and then we're going to take a look at another method that uses no macros in a future video. So to start off with, we're going to take a look at an example object that you'd want to serialize. And so here we have our example object class. Doesn't matter if it's a class or a struct. And then you want to inherit from serialized. And in our public field, we have an integer, a float, and in our private field, we have a boolean. And then right here, we have our serialized macros. Now to start off, you need to make sure that the macros are within a public field, and we'll explain why in a moment. And this boolean at the bottom is to show off that you don't need variables to be declared before your macros. As well, it doesn't matter if they're private, protected, or public. It will work either way. So to start with serialization, you need to define a serialized class macro and pass in the object class name that you want to serialize. Then you want to pass in serialized variable macros, and you need to pass the type, so this is an integer, and the actual variable itself. And once you've defined all of your variables, you will then need to call serialized class end to end the serialized class call. Now let's take a look at serialized to see what is happening with this base class. Inside of serialized, we have a single virtual void called serialize, and it takes in this object called serialized info. So the way that these serialization macros work is they basically just override this macro to serialize the object, and this serialized info object gets passed in to handle all of our serialization. Now, it's very important that you have it set up like this with a serialized object coming in, because if you didn't have an object coming in to handle serialization, you could technically turn this into a const char return, but it wouldn't make any sense due to the fact that we'd need two functions in, serialize and deserialize, and with the macros, working with one function call is a lot easier. So let's take a look at serialized info. This class, to start off with, has a boolean here, and this boolean is telling me whether we are serializing or deserializing. If we are serializing, we will of course pipe to our outstream, and if we were deserializing, we'd of course read from our instream. Now I'm using a library called YAML CPP just so I can read and write to a YAML format, but you can take any type of streaming object and use it in the same manner. If you wanted to use your own implementation, you could use an std stream and simply pipe to that, because all we're going to do is write the values to a file, so that would work just fine. So let's take a look at the macros now. And for the macros, let's start with the serialized class macro. This starts off by grabbing the class name, of course, and then it overrides this virtual void serialized that we had in the base class. And then we start off by initializing our outstream. And we would just want to place in a key with the class name, and we're using the hashtag to get the class name not as the type, but rather as a const char. And so once we've piped in the class name as the key so we can later look up this class, we then want to be calling begin map, and in YAML this is just saying that we're beginning a map of variables. Now in our serialized variable macro call, where we took the type and the variable, we first want to check and see if we're serializing. And this is where we're checking to see if we need to deserialize or serialize. And we start off, if we're serializing, by going to our outstream and inputting a key as the variable name. And again, we're using the hashtag to make it not the type, but a const char value. And then we are piping in the actual value of the variable. Now, below that, we have our check if we are not serializing. If we are deserializing, we first want to check if the variable exists within our context. So if the variable does not exist within our input stream, then the variable could have been removed from the class at some point, or we might have a variable that was added to a class after the save file was created. So this will prevent crashes from variables changing as you rewrite classes. Now, once we know that this variable does exist inside of our input stream, we will take the variable and we will grab that const char value from our input stream, and we will cast it to our type that we passed in earlier. Now, The YAML CPP library has this fancy .as function to help you with that. But if you were using a std stream, you could just use a const chart a string, and then you can cast a string to any other type of value, such as an integer or a bool or whatever you may need to. And you can pass in as many serialized variable calls as you want, because as you can see, this looks like a function if you look at it at its entirety. And so if you just keep placing these in the middle, it'll just keep calling these if-else statements over and over and over until it reaches the serialized class end function, which in this case just ends our map and ends our function. So if you were not using a map, in my case, you could just put the ending bracket of the macro. So now that we understand what the macros are doing and what the objects are doing for the serialization, let's take a look at an example of serializing something within the console. So in our main function here, which we're going to run, we first define a serialize info object, and we set it to true because we are serializing our data. Then we create a new example object like we looked at before, and we're calling object.serialize, and we're passing in our serialize info. Now, to indicate that variables can change, we are now going to change our object variables, and we're going to reserialize. And then down here, all we're doing is outputting that outstream into the console so that we can read it. And I'm just using a input getter so that we can pause. So let's go ahead and run this and take a look at what happens. All right, so as you guys can see here, we got our example object when we serialized, and then this is the beginning of our map, and then we got our example int with its value, our example float with its value, and look, that boolean came in just fine. And then in the code, we changed our int and float and reserialized. So as you can see, the output stream has another example object. The integer has changed its value. The float has also changed its value, and we did not change the boolean, so that stayed the same. So as you can see, you can write this, instead of to a console, you can write this to a file. And then when you read the file, it would look for the name example int, and then give you the value of 20, example float, the value of 34 point this, and so on and so forth. So it's a very simple process for serializing and deserializing using macros, and there's nothing too advanced that's going on here. It's just simple streaming and saving things with the correct name and values. Now, the reason that you would use something like this is because C++ doesn't actually provide any information about objects because it's a compiled language. If you were using something like C#, you can use the built-in reflection to find out all this information and serialize classes without even needing to put in macros, because all that information doesn't need to be defined. It can be retrieved at runtime. But I hope you guys enjoyed this little look into serialization. If you guys want to see an example of serialization without macros, take a look at my next video. But other than that, I hope you guys enjoyed the tutorial, and take care.